Let me introduce our final speakers for today, day one. Maggie Hayes is the Community Product Manager for Data Hub and part of the founding team at Acryl Data. And John Joyce is the co-founder and tech lead at Acryl Data, the company behind open source metadata platform, Data Hub. The title of their talk, I love this, Data Swamp to Data Swimming Pool, Cleaning Up the Mess with Modern Data Governance. Please welcome Maggie Hayes and John Joyce.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I hope it's been an exciting and informative day for you here. John, you want to kick things off?
Yeah, thanks everyone for staying to the last talk as well. Hopefully you're not too tired, but I promise happy hour is coming. So today we're going to talk about some challenges that we see pretty often at Acryl Data, our company, around modern data practices. And specifically, we're going to talk about approaches to cleaning up some of those problems and addressing the mess with modern data governance. Before we get started, we'll just do quick intros. I'm John, co-founder of Acryl Data, and prior to Acryl, I worked at LinkedIn, where I drove big data initiatives for governance and standardization across offline data as well as online APIs.
And I'm Maggie. I'm the Community Product Manager for Data Hub. We'll tell you a little bit more about Data Hub in a minute. But prior to this, I've worked in kind of all things analytics, all things data for about 12, 13 years at this point. So I've been everything from an analyst to an analytics engineer, BI engineer, data engineer, product manager, all of the things. So this area is very near and dear to my heart, to say the least.
Awesome, and a little bit about Acryl Data, the company we both work for. It was founded in early 2021 by data engineers from companies like LinkedIn and Airbnb who had run sort of big data governance initiatives. And what we do is we build tools to help bring clarity and control to complex data ecosystems by driving forward the Data Hub project, which we'll talk about in just a moment. In terms of the team, we have 16 full-time employees from a diverse set of backgrounds like LinkedIn, Google, Facebook, Spot Hero, and I think we have at least 6 dogs on the team that we see at our virtual happy hours every week, which makes things super interesting. You can learn more about Acryl at acryldata.io, but now we're going to take a moment to just talk about Data Hub, which is the open source product that we push forward.
Awesome. So like I said, I'm the Community Product Manager for Data Hub. Data Hub is really meant to be a central pane of glass across all of the entities within your data stack. So first and foremost, we offer kind of a centralized search experience. So regardless of where your data is stored, regardless of if it's a data set, a Kafka topic, a dashboard, Python notebook, we have a central spot for you to search across all of those. The other thing we talk a lot about is this idea of metadata 360, so really having a kind of well-rounded picture of your data assets. So what we're looking at here is a data set profile page, so specifically looking at kind of like the physical structure of that data. You can also enrich it with documentation. You can have that at the data set level, the column level. But then when we think about the metadata 360, we push it further with applying kind of that logical metadata, so how it fits within the kind of business construct of your organization. We can also assign ownership to it, so you have a clear line of sight into who is responsible and for what. And then, of course, Data Hub does a really great job of kind of helping you understand the end-to-end lineage or journey of your data, so all the way from where it was originally produced, and how it can be kind of transformed, processed, and ultimately surfaced up in your reporting tools or your analytic tools from there. From a community standpoint, Data Hub is the leading open source project for a metadata platform. We host or we support more than 50 integrations within kind of like modern data tooling. So if you, chances are we cover with the tools that you're using, so you can integrate super easily with that. We also have a ton of really great folks in the community who have officially adopted Data Hub and have that running in production, and really are running it at scale in really complex systems. So it's kind of tried and true and working well there. From a community standpoint, We're at around 4,700 folks in our Slack community. We have folks joining us from, I think, 68 different countries at this point, and 23 different time zones. And then generally speaking, we tend to see data engineers, software engineers joining, doing a lot of like troubleshooting conversations, but really excited to see that we're starting to see more folks around like with data science backgrounds, product management, and we're starting to have a lot more of these metadata management, actually like meta conversations about how we can solve this as a community.
Okay, enough about Data Hub. Now we're going to turn to why we are here talking to you. Over the past couple of years at Acryl, we've seen a few trends or emergent problems associated with a modern data stack. And we're going to coin that sort of the modern data swamp. And what we're going to talk to you today about is how you can move from a modern data swamp to something more akin to a beautiful swimming pool that would be not only nicer to look at, but safer to swim in. And just a quick overview of what we'll cover. First, we'll talk about what we mean by the modern data swamp. Then we'll go into a framework or a way to think about how to move from a swamp to more of that beautiful swimming pool. Then we'll put it into practice with the real example, and finally, we'll end with kind of the next frontier of governance and where we think this space is headed. With that, we'll jump right into it. So to illustrate the point and the problems associated with the modern data ecosystem, we're going to take an example of a fictional digital pet adoption company called Longtail Companions. And basically, this company matches adopters with pets, so potential adoptees. So you can imagine with cute little puppies and kittens. And it's an e-commerce website, right? So it has a lot of interesting things like recommendations and notifications and everything you would expect. Now, over the years, Longtail has developed a complex, modern data ecosystem. And what we're going to do now is just double-click into what their data ecosystem looks like.
All right, so first and foremost, we have the applications team. So their core application, the adoptions team, their core application is really meant to kind of track all of those adoptions as things go. So they're storing all of their transactional data in Postgres. Postgres does a great job with transactional data. Then to store some of those more unstructured or document-based data sets, they use MongoDB. We then have the e-commerce team where they're really focused on, making sure that every pet that's adopted is also able to buy it. You can buy a leash or you can buy your kitty litter to really, make sure that that pet is well taken care of. And again, they're storing their transactional data in Postgres, but now in this case, they're actually using Kafka to start to understand the clickstream analytics and how folks are kind of navigating that site. We then have our central data platform team who is syncing all of that data from all of those different resources using Airflow, landing that in their central data lake in S3. They then leverage Spark to transform those kind of high volume, complex data processes, land that data in Snowflake for more analytical workflows. And then you have your analytics engineering team who's actually in charge of making use of this data. And they're using tools like dbt for ETL processes, Great Expectations for data validation, and then Looker to ultimately surface that to stakeholders. So what we end up with is very diverse implementations across these different teams. Each of them serve a very meaningful and purposeful use case, but you end up with a very fragmented data stack that can be really difficult to navigate.
Yeah, so we'll just take a look at some of the good properties of the architecture that have emerged over the years. The first is that it's flexible, and by flexible I mean it's easy to either extend the architecture, for example, adding a new system that consumes data from your warehouse, as well as to plug in new pieces of the architecture. So for example, to swap out Looker for another dashboarding tool like Superset, Mode, etc. The second thing is by virtue of being decentralized, there's no central sort of vendor lock-in risk. Although there is some vendor lock-in, it's distributed among many different tools. The second benefit is around the agility that this is unlocked, right? So we've put data in the hands of folks who can best derive value from it. Our data analysts are able to spin up new dashboards on Looker very quickly and consume data from Snowflake immediately. The final thing is scalability, right? So all of these are offered as managed services. As a central data engineering team, we don't have any operational overhead for scaling or running these services. And now we're going to talk about some of the hard questions that have evolved as our data stack has kind of grown more complex. The first is you can imagine a situation where the data platform team is being audited. And they're being asked to provide information on which data sets, dashboards, and pipelines contain email addresses or social security numbers, right? The second case is when an analytics engineering team wants to know if there's already a piece of data that can accommodate the needs that they have. So for example, is there already a data set that contains the total adoptions per customer, or do I have to go and create that data set from scratch? And then finally, questions around accountability, right? So something is wrong with the data set. In this case, let's say the pet profiles data set. Who's responsible for fixing it? Is it the data platform team who manages Snowflake, or is it the upstream adoption team who manages the application layer? And I shouldn't have to sell you guys too hard on these problems because they're very relevant, especially in the EU, but compliance is the central concern here, along with some other interesting problems around cost and reliability, so duplication of data, along with data reliability and accountability. So that leads me to the not so good parts of the data ecosystem that have made these questions hard to answer. The first is just increasing inconsistency, right? In terms of modeling, labeling, documentation, there's kind of increasingly divergent workflows that is kind of tool-centric. So folks who work with Looker do documentation very differently than folks who work with MongoDB upstream. The second is around ownership. So there's kind of ad hoc ownership. There's no centralized notion of ownership. What that means is that there's unclear accountability across platforms. So again, it's not clear that when something breaks, who should be responsible for fixing it. And then finally, there's sort of a lack of semantic context. And what I mean by that is there's a lack of kind of logical metadata about why particular data assets exist, whether it's a data set in Snowflake or a dashboard on Looker. And this is kind of what we coin the modern data swamp. And so what do we mean by this? Well, it's not a lack of high-value data. It's not the traditional data swamp, right? But instead, it's a lack of context and coordination and accountability, right, that's required to maintain a healthy data ecosystem, where a healthy data ecosystem is defined as cost-effective, compliant, reliable, and scalable. And so this is where we think that data governance can really begin to help. And now we'll turn to what we define as sort of the data swimming pool. So what does a well-governed ecosystem look like that can help to answer some of these questions? Well, first, it has clear ownership, right? This serves as a foundation upon which the other pillars will reside, but it establishes accountability and expertise for individual pieces of data. The second is documentation. So as I touched on earlier, this higher level understanding of what the purpose of a particular data asset is. As you all know, for GDPR, we need to keep that in mind, and we need to be able to give that to an auditor within 30 days. And then finally, classification. So this is really just standardizing the terminology that we use when we model data or we talk about data so that we can ask broad spanning questions about where is the sensitive data inside of our ecosystem. And the vision that we think we have and that many companies share with us is that this information should ideally exist for every data asset, whether it's in Mongo, Snowflake, Looker, or beyond. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. This is not specific to long-tail companions. These problems are sort of universal. We've seen them in the last 2 years across many different types of companies. And usually what happens is that people end up not actually taking any action because where we are here with the swamp is very, very different from where we have to go, the vision. In the case of long tail, maybe we have thousands of data sets or hundreds of data pipelines that we need to backfill with this structure in this semantic context, which represents the real challenge here. But I think what we want to talk about today is that the key to actually starting to climb is to understand that in order to get to the top, you have to go here first, right? You have to make it to the first peak, and you need to make it incremental. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Maggie, who's going to talk about a framework for thinking about going from the bottom to the top.
Yeah, so Personally, I've gone through this exercise a handful of times at a couple of different organizations, and just the sheer volume of work that's required can be really, really daunting, and it can also be tempting to kind of try to solve it all at once. I've tried that. I have failed miserably at that, and I would like to share this with you so you do not make that same mistake, because it was painful and, quite frankly, very embarrassing to go through that. Turns out if you present a set of engineers with a bunch of Google Sheets and say, please document this, they will laugh at you and they will not do it at all. So yeah, what we're going to talk through is kind of an iterative approach to take and start to kind of build out these workflows and this framework. So as a prerequisite, it is super important you have a spot to store this information. Right now we're talking about Data Hub. It doesn't have to be Data Hub. Of course, selfishly, we would love for it to be Data Hub for everyone, but the TLDR is you need a spot to surface all this information and ultimately kind of keep track of it, make sure that it's up to date. So we're going to move forward with the assumption that you have a data catalog in place or otherwise a spot to kind of store all of this context. That being said, just because you have a tool does not mean that it is magically now a swimming pool. Your swamp has not gotten any cleaner. If anything, you may be even more overwhelmed because suddenly you see you have 200,000 entities that you have to figure out how to govern. Like, that's insane, right? So how do we start to break this apart and make it much more iterative? So what we're going to talk through is this kind of incremental approach. There's 4 different steps to this. First and foremost, we're going to set clear goals. We'll then narrow the scope, and then surprise, we're going to narrow that scope again. From there, we're going to drive incremental action, measure our progress, then we'll lather, rinse, repeat, and go through it one more time. So let's actually step into these and see what we are talking about with this. So when you're at the early stages, maybe you're on day 1 of a governance exercise, it is critical to set clear goals and to understand why it's even worth doing. So this could be that your organization is facing some pretty extreme compliance concerns, and you want to start kind of classifying your entities and really focus on addressing those compliance issues. So your goal there would be to really start building out that classification workflow. Maybe instead of that, you're starting to deal with unreliable data, and there's just a ton of confusion about who owns what it represents, who's on the hook for getting that cleaned up. And so in this regard, you would want to start more with like an ownership exercise. But again, it really comes down to your organization and the kind of biggest problems that you're facing, so you can really start to set clear goals to execute against that. Step 2, narrow your scope. So again, if you have a fragmented data stack with thousands or hundreds and thousands, we've literally talked to people that have hundreds and thousands on the verge of millions of entities to govern. You will not be able to do it all in one fell swoop. I promise you, please, you will not do that. Like, it will not go well. So narrow your scope, and by that, you're going to go back to your step 1, think through the goals that you set out for yourself, and focus on the data that matters the most. So some ways that we found that can be helpful in kind of breaking this down. This is not an exhaustive list, but just to give you some ideas. Maybe you want to start on a specific platform, and then from there, maybe you actually want to narrow it down even further by domain. Maybe you've leaned into the data mesh of it all, and you have your data organized within domains. But this can be really helpful for kind of narrowing the scope of who you would want to be working with. Another way is to look at it by usage. So maybe instead of trying to govern all of your data sets, you want to focus on the ones that are used by 25% of your organization, or they're like the top used within a time period. But the idea here is like you're going through this exercise for the first few times, focus on building out the framework, not on solving it all at once. So cut that scope and then seriously cut it some more. I promise it's worth cutting it some more. And then from there, you're actually driving incremental action. Probably more often than not, you're asking other teams to do a thing, right? You're setting some guidelines around what it means to be an owner of an entity, or you're asking your subject matter experts to provide documentation to enrich that entity, or maybe start kind of classifying it. So it's super critical, since you are literally asking other people to do work, it's critical to start with groups that are very invested in that outcome. So start with a small set of stakeholders that are highly invested in this, and they understand the problem that's being solved that you've set out in your first step, right? They should kind of feel incentivized and understand that, like, why that's a hard problem or why that's a problem worth solving. The next part of this is to set very clear expectations. So when you're asking someone to be an owner, what does that mean, right? Like, it's very easy to say, hey, can you own this? And sure, but why? What am I doing with it? That's another thing I've done where I've done like full-fledged ownership campaigns, and people are like, yeah, sure, I'll own it. What do I own? And it's just very confusing. So just be very clear on what you mean and kind of what those responsibilities are. The other part is create rapid feedback loops. I've been most successful when we have very clear check-ins. That could be anything from a daily stand-up, a weekly retro, a Slack message, whatever it is. But like really work with them and understand what's working, what's not. Are they still on board with this? Do they still understand why it's worth doing? Do we still agree that this is worth doing? All of that fun stuff. If you're having a hard time kind of envisioning who you would start with, here's some tips for you. If you're starting with a group of stakeholders, maybe you don't have like a well-established relationship with them, really focus on making it very obvious why this is worth doing. Do not assume that they understand that like a documentation exercise or an ownership exercise, like don't take it for granted that they get why that's worth it. So make it super obvious, and again, they should be highly incentivized or kind of aligned with those outcomes so that you can really just focus on moving forward. Make it easy, so make it super clear what you're asking them to do and what success looks like. That way they can just focus on executing. Of course, you don't want to be like a dictator in it. So if they're confused by it or if they're not totally bought in, maybe you kind of work through some of that, but really just make it so that they're focusing on the execution. And then the last part is just make sure that you're collaborating and not over-prescribing how they do it. Remember, I went into that room with a bunch of engineers with a bunch of Google Sheets and said, hi, can you document this? And they literally laughed in my face. I will remember that day for the rest of my life. So the problem that I had there was I didn't get the buy-in. They had no idea why I was asking them to do anything. What I thought was easy was not actually easy for them, and I was over-prescribing how they were meant to do something. So focus more on setting those outcomes and let them kind of drive that. Oops, there we go. And then in terms of measuring progress, I think it's really, really easy for us to get very bought into what we're doing and to continue doing it because, well, we invested in it, we decided it was worth doing, so we should see it through. But ultimately, maybe you're not actually like realizing the value that you sought out to gain. Maybe your organization actually isn't like being supportive within the initiative, and maybe your goals have shifted a little bit. So as you're measuring progress, it's not only did we do what we sought out to do, but is this having the impact that we wanted so that when we go back and do this again, we feel good and confident that it's worth that exercise. When you get to a spot where you feel confident in those measurements, as early as possible start automating that measurement. That way you can kind of set and forget it and like really turn this into an ongoing workflow, and you can kind of continue to monitor the kind of value or the completion of that work. Last but not least, you iterate, lather, rinse, repeat. It could be with the same stakeholder and a different subset of data. It could be with a different stakeholder group, a new set of data. But the more that you go through this, just continue to iterate and figure out what works best for your organization. So with all of that in mind, we're going to go into kind of a practical example of this with Mr. John.
Yeah, so thanks, Maggie. That was a great overview. We're going to go into a practical example of kind of applying the framework that Maggie just introduced, going back to the long tail companions example that we had earlier. We're also going to kind of touch on the point that you covered at the end there about automation. So automating the process of running a governance initiative so that you make the chances of you being successful higher. So the first thing that as long tail companions we would want to do is just, again, set those clear goals around what we want as the outcome. I think we touched on the vision earlier, but ideally in long tail, every data set should have ownership, which is defined as at least one formal owner assigned, documentation, which is well-structured sort of logical context that we can easily use to search and discover, and then classification, so like labeling from a central vocabulary or taxonomy. Next, we're going to narrow the scope. right? So we have data sets across Mongo, Snowflake, and beyond, but we're going to narrow the scope just to data sets with the following characteristics. They're in Snowflake because as a central data engineering team, we own Snowflake, so we can easily get started there, prove out the concept, and then expand. Now the challenge is that our Snowflake warehouse may have thousands of tables by itself, so what we can do is continue to cut the scope even within Snowflake. And in this case, what we're going to do is look for important data sets on Snowflake. And how we define important at Longtail is that they have a high query volume. So maybe they're in the top 25 percentile of the most used tables on Snowflake. The second is around how many users actually use the table, right? So maybe we can use unique user count as a proxy for importance. So maybe any table on Snowflake that has greater than one user, we want to actually include in the initial scope. What I'm going to demo next is just how we can use a tool like Data Hub to actually automate this process of scoping. So what we're going to do is define an automation inside of Data Hub that's going to select those tables in Snowflake that have a high query usage in the top 25% and have a high unique user count, which is, again, just greater than one user. So what we're doing here is just defining those conditions inside of your catalog. The catalog already will go out and actually index all of this information, so you can imagine how challenging this would be if you don't have it already there. So we can use things like the query count percentile in the last 30 days. And we're going to say that it must be, let's say, greater than 75, meaning it's in the top 25%. And then finally, we're again going to look at the unique users, or the accounts that are using that table. And we're going to say that they must be greater than 1, which maybe means they are important. And then we're going to see how many data assets come out of this. And we're going to adjust as we need to and then run that initiative. So here we can add some rules. We're going to skip this for now. We'll come back to it in just a moment. But what we're really interested in doing is once we've identified those assets, kind of labeling them or adding structure so that we know which ones they are. And so that's what we're going to do in this third step is we're just going to add a label, a tier label in particular called tier 1. So we're going to say all data sets that have those properties are now in tier 1. Finally, we're going to give our automation, a name, a category, a description. And once we save it, it'll start to kind of run continuously against our entire data ecosystem. So you'll see at first, maybe there's nothing there, but hopefully there will be something. So you can see there, we have 91 tables that match that criteria, right? So this is a way that we can just begin to automate that process of saying, hey, what is important on Snowflake and where should we start, right? And we're really focusing on impact first by doing this as a way to prove out the value of the initiative. So once we do that, we can try to drive incremental action, as Maggie talked about. At Longtail, step 1 would be just to identify the experts who are kind of owners of that data implicitly already. There's 2 ways we can do this. Technically, we can look at something like the Snowflake audit logs, right? And we can actually scrape them and see who's accessing the tables or who created the table. We can also use tribal knowledge, so we can manually go talk to people in our organization and figure out who knows what about a given table. Or we can use a tool like Data Hub, which will surface that information to you kind of for free. And then we want to plan the work. So at Longtail, we use Linear to track work. You could use Jira or whatever to actually run the initiative, which is a human process that you're going to have to run. There's no way to kind of shortcut that. Unfortunately, we've amounted a bunch of governance debt, and what we're doing with this initiative is addressing some of that debt. And then finally, we're going to measure the progress of our initiative. And again, we're going to look to automation to do this. In this case, we're going to use Data Hub again to start to monitor how we're doing against our governance initiative. So what we can do is we can start by selecting all of the tables that were identified as tier 1. So everything that we said was important. Once we've identified those, we're going to add a set of rules. This is basically conditions that all tier 1 data sets need to be meeting. So we're going to say that each tier 1 data set needs to have a description. It also needs to have what we call a classification label. You can think of this as kind of a standardized label that's centrally governed. And then finally, we're going to say that ownership must exist on Data Hub for this table explicitly. Once we do this, we can go ahead and try it out against some real tables that we've already indexed in Data Hub. We could see one fails, one passes, meaning that it already has all of the requisite information associated with it. Then we can kind of skip all of this part. We'll just put some labels on it, name it, and then we'll save it. And the same thing will happen as before. So over time, you'll see that we start to track the tables that are passing and failing. So this is a great lever to continue to monitor your governance initiative over time as your data continues to change, right? So you don't have to go and define these conditions again or actually run a manual process here. Okay, so once we've done this, we've identified the first 100 or so data sets, we've governed them. Now, again, we just kind of have to increase the scope and continue to iterate as we climb up this mount governance. All right, I think we're pretty much almost up on time, so I'm going to be a little quick here, but now we're just going to talk about what we think the next frontier of governance looks like. So what we showed you is an approach to kind of start to address a bunch of governance debt that you've accumulated with the modern data stack over the years. But as you may notice, this is kind of a reactive approach, right? So once this data exists, now we're trying to go back and add that structure. And so we think that in the long term, sustainable data governance comes from two things. One, distributing the responsibility of governance beyond a central team, right? So making governance a priority for the team, any team that's using data. The second is integrating governance into the life cycle of a data asset at your company. So imagine that when you create a table on Snowflake, you automatically have to provide the ownership, the description, and that semantic context that you need for a scalable data ecosystem. And so that's kind of the topic of our next talk. Definitely be sure to tune in, but for now we're just going to recap what we went over today. The most important points are that data governance practices can start to help answer questions in the modern data ecosystem that have become very difficult to answer in many companies. The second is that progress is much more important than perfection. You should cut scope, prove the value, and iterate. And finally, as you do this, have an eye towards the future and think about sustainability. Develop a long-term plan towards distributing the governance responsibility and making it a proactive part of data lifecycle management. Thanks for listening. I think that's it, and we'll take questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, guys, for that really practical talk. I think it's a perfect way to finish day one of the Crunch Conference. And now you know how we do. We turn to Slido.
Oh, great.
And we're going to start with our top question. You can document same things with Looker and DBT. Engineer works with DBT, data scientist with Looker. What is the way to define source of truth in such cases?
Love this. Okay, so a couple of things. A lot of this kind of comes down from what we've seen in kind of like best practices that you establish across those functions. So if you think about, you have your engineering team, analytics engineering team, working within Data Hub, or sorry, well, they're probably working within Data Hub, my goodness. No, they're working within DBT, really figuring out how do they kind of qualify what is the source of truth versus maybe something that's more exploratory or staging. One way that we can actually show this within a data catalog is through, kind of having a certification workflow or some kind of glossary terms or tags. But again, it's developing those best practices and then applying them consistently. So how that might look for a data engineer may be different from how it's defined within a team that's maybe owning dashboards or charts, but really what you should be focusing on is more establishing the need for identifying a source of truth and then leaving it up to those teams to say, how are you going to do it, right? So it goes back to that. Your end goal is, I assert that we should have a source of a mechanism by which we consistently say this is the source of truth. Here's what it's going to look like. How you guys build that workflow, you know your workflows best, so do it in a way that's going to scale.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add to that the problem with doing it in these tools is the accessibility problem, right? So I don't work with DBT, so I'm not going to see the documentation. So I think where the documentation is defined doesn't necessarily matter as long as it's surfaced into some central place, right? And that's kind of what Data Hub, that's what Data Hub can be for you, is really that central place. And in fact, we have integrations that can actually take the metadata that you've defined on your DBT models or in Looker and pulling that all into a central place so that the rest of your organization doesn't have to comb through, GitHub repositories or Looker to find it.
I like this tandem thing you guys got going on here. It's working great. Let's keep it going. How does data governance add value when it covers a highly reduced scope?
I love
For the use
this.
case I have in mind for this, the whole point is to have a 100% picture.
Yeah. So we are certainly not saying that only govern one part of it. We're more saying start small, iterate, and figure out how you can get to that 100%. And also along the way, in a ton of conversations we've had, we talk a lot about like ownership, right? How do you define what it means to be an owner and ultimately roll that out? A lot of what we talk about is it more important to be 100% accurate for 20% of your entities or 20% accurate for across 100% of your entities, right? So really it comes down to the value that you're driving towards. And really what we're saying is not that you shouldn't govern 100%. It's that do not start by trying to govern everything all at once, and more start small where you know there's high impact, and then figure out how you can iteratively roll that out.
Okay, guys, we have time for one more question.
Great.
You know what to do. You get to pick this one.
Okay, do you want to choose? I'm talking a lot. I talk a lot, it's fine. Bum, bum, bum.
Sorry, guys, just
There's
catching
one
up
here.
on the stream.
I can answer the how long does it take with like, concrete examples.
Yeah, take it. Well,
Okay,
I'll
so
chime in if
how long does
yeah.
it take to scale to multiple iterations that will make the case relevant to business? I went through this in my last company. I worked at a company called Spot Hero. Honestly, it was the first time I had done it in this specific domain, and I was doing a ton of kind of coaching and like bringing people on board. I didn't have those invested stakeholders up front. So it took probably about 2 months to get buy-in that it was worth doing. In terms of running through those iterations, we went through probably three sprints, so 3 2-week sprints, before we had kind of a solid case study to show to other teams. And as soon as we had that, it was freaking fast, right? As soon as we had something that was not so opaque and not this kind of like, wouldn't it be nice if we had everything documented? It was more, here's exactly what we mean by it, and here's how other teams have gotten there. We went from, I think, maybe 10% coverage of, we were doing some documentation and ownership around our clickstream analytics. The first probably 10% took about 6 weeks, and then we got to 100% within, I think, about a month. So it kind of depends, but really that iteration cycle, if you can get that process or the kind of handoffs and the responsibilities really nailed down and well communicated, it goes remarkably quickly.
Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah.
Big round of applause for Maggie and John.
Thanks for having us.